You know what they say about revenge? That it's a dish best served cold. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes revenge tastes like betrayal, feels like love, and costs you everything you thought you knew about yourself. My name is Jasmine, and this is the story of how I lost everything twice. The first time, life took it from me. The second time, I gave it away willingly, all for a chance to make the people who destroyed my world pay for what they'd done. They say you become the monster you're fighting against. I used to think that was just something people said in movies. Now I know better. Because when you've got nothing left to lose, when grief becomes your fuel and rage becomes your compass, you'll do things you never thought possible. You'll hurt people you never meant to hurt. You'll cross lines you swore you'd never cross. And sometimes you'll find that the person you were trying to protect yourself from was yourself all along. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back when I still believed that good things happen to good people, back when I thought family was forever and love could conquer all. Back when I was naive enough to think that the worst thing that could happen to me was losing my little boutique shop. If only I'd known what real loss felt like. Picture this. A small boutique shop on the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard and 135th Street, right in the heart of Harlem. The kind of place where the bell above the door actually means something, where every customer feels like family, and where dreams are displayed on hangers alongside vintage dresses and handmade jewelry. That was my world. Jasmine's Threads, not the most creative name, I'll admit, but it was mine. Every sequin, every thread, every carefully curated piece told a story. My story. Our story. I was 32 then, old enough to know better, but young enough to still believe in fairy tales. You know that age where you're supposed to have it all figured out, but you're still trying to convince yourself that making it doesn't necessarily mean making millions? That was me. Every morning, I'd unlock those glass doors with keys that felt heavier than they should have, flip that little sign from closed to open, and pretend that the stack of unpaid bills hidden under my register didn't exist. But here's the thing about struggling. It teaches you to appreciate the small victories. A good sales day meant ramen noodles upgraded to takeout Chinese. A great sales day meant I could actually pay both the electric bill and the rent in the same month. And the absolute best days? Those were the days when my little brother Derek would stop by after school, guitar case slung over his shoulder, eyes bright with whatever new song was rattling around in his head. Derek was everything I wasn't, optimistic where I was practical, dreamy where I was grounded, confident where I was cautious. At 19, he had this way of walking into a room and making everyone believe that good things were just around the corner. He'd sprawl across my vintage velvet couch in the back of the shop, tuning his guitar while I sorted through inventory, and he'd tell me about his plans. "Jazz, I'm telling you, this song I wrote is going to change everything," he'd say, fingers dancing across the strings. I played it at the open mic last night, and this producer guy, he gave me his card. I'd look up from whatever I was doing, usually trying to figure out how to stretch $20 into groceries for the week, and I'd see him there, all lanky limbs and big dreams, and despite everything, despite the bills and the stress and the constant worry, I'd believe him. Because when someone you love believes in something that hard, it becomes contagious. "Play it for me," I'd always say, and he would. Right there in my little shop, surrounded by clothes that cost more than most people in our neighborhood could afford, my baby brother would play his heart out like he was performing at Madison Square Garden. Those were the moments that made everything worth it. Not the successful sales, not the rare compliments from customers, but those quiet afternoons when it was just me and Derek and music filling up all the spaces where worry used to live. But the real anchor in our lives, the person who kept us both grounded and reaching for the stars at the same time, was our grandmother, Maureen. Grandma Maureen, with her silver hair always perfectly pressed, her house shoes that somehow made her look more regal than any designer heels ever could, and her way of looking at you like she could see straight through to your soul. Maureen had raised us after our parents died in a car accident when I was 15 and Derek was just 2. She took on 2 grieving kids with nothing but a social security check and a heart big enough to fill all the empty spaces our parents had left behind. She never complained, never made us feel like burdens, never let us forget that we were loved even when love felt like the only thing we had. Every Sunday, without fail, Derek and I would make our way to Maureen's apartment, a tidy 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a walk-up that smelled like pine sol and whatever magic she was cooking in her kitchen. She'd have dinner waiting, the good china set out like we were royalty, and stories about our parents that made them feel real instead of just photographs on her mantle. "Your mama had dreams just like you, baby girl," she'd tell me while we washed dishes together, her weathered hands moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from decades of practice. She wanted to be a fashion designer, you know. Drew pictures of dresses all over everything. I used to find sketches tucked in books, taped to her bedroom walls, folded up in her pockets. She'd pause then, looking out her kitchen window at the neighborhood beyond, and I could see her remembering. She would have been so proud of that little shop of yours. So proud of how you took that dream and made it real. And then she'd turn to Derek, who'd be tuning his guitar at her kitchen table, completely absorbed in getting each string just right. And your daddy, boy, he had music in his bones just like you do. Used to drive me crazy, always tapping on something, humming under his breath. But Lord, when he played that piano, these weren't just stories to Maureen. They were gifts. Ways of keeping our parents alive in the room with us, making sure we knew that our dreams weren't just ours. They were legacy, continuation, proof that love doesn't die just because people do. Maureen had this way of making you feel like you were exactly where you were supposed to be, even when where you were wasn't necessarily where you wanted to be. When the boutique was struggling, when I'd lie awake at night doing math that never seemed to add up right, when the weight of trying to keep everything together felt too heavy, I'd remember her words, "Baby, struggling ain't failing. Struggling is just the work you do before the breakthrough." She believed in us with a fierceness that was almost spiritual. Not in some blind, everything will be fine way, but in a deeper way that acknowledged the hardship while refusing to let it have the final word. She taught us that dreams weren't just wishes, they were responsibilities. Responsibilities to the people who came before us and sacrificed for us to have chances they never got. "You keep that shop running, Jasmine," she'd say, pressing Tupperware containers full of leftovers into my hands as I prepared to leave each Sunday. "You keep creating beauty in this world. And Derek, you keep making music. This world needs more beauty, more music, more love. That's not optional, you hear me? That's your job." Looking back now, I realize that Maureen was teaching us something profound about resilience. She was showing us that you can acknowledge pain without being destroyed by it, that you can honor loss without being defined by it, and that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to give up on the possibility of joy. But more than anything, she was showing us what love looked like in action. Love that stayed up all night when you had a fever. Love that celebrated every small victory like it was a major triumph. Love that saw your potential even when you couldn't see it yourself. Love that believed in your dreams even when they seemed impossible. We were a unit, the 3 of us. Broken in some ways, healing in others, but complete in the ways that mattered. We had each other, and when you've got that, when you've got people who know your story and love you anyway, who see your dreams and help you chase them, who show up for every small victory and every devastating defeat, when you have that, you think you can handle anything. I used to think our little family was unbreakable. I used to think that as long as we had each other, nothing could really hurt us. I used to think that love was armor, that it could protect the people you cared about from the ugliness of the world. I was so naive. I had no idea how quickly everything could change. How one moment could split your life into before and after. How violence could reach into your world and steal everything that mattered. How the very love that made you feel invincible could become the thing that destroyed you when it was torn away. Jasmine's Threads wasn't just a business to me, it was a statement. In a world that often made Black women feel invisible, I wanted to create a space where we were seen, celebrated, adorned. Every piece I selected told a story of resilience, of beauty, of refusing to be diminished by circumstances. The boutique occupied the ground floor of a brownstone that had seen better decades, wedged between Mrs. Rodriguez's Dominican hair salon and an Ethiopian restaurant that filled the entire block with the scent of berbera and injera. The neighborhood was one of those places that gentrification hadn't quite reached yet, where old-timers still sat on stoops gossiping about everyone's business, and corner stores still gave credit to families they'd known for generations. My shop was small, maybe 800 square feet if you counted the storage room in the back, but I'd arranged every inch with the kind of care you reserve for sacred spaces. The walls were painted a warm gold that made everyone's skin look luminous, and I'd hung vintage mirrors at different heights so every woman who walked in could see herself from angles that made her feel beautiful. I specialized in what I called everyday elegance, pieces that could take you from the subway to the office to dinner without missing a beat. A wrap dress that felt like a hug but looked like power. Blazers with just enough structure to command respect, but soft enough to dance in. Jewelry that whispered instead of shouted, but still made sure everyone knew you had something to say. My customers became my extended family. There was Mrs. Patterson, who worked double shifts at the hospital and would stop by every other Friday to find something that made her feel like more than just scrubs and exhaustion. She'd hold up potential purchases to a reflection and ask, "Does this say I save lives, or does it say I'm too tired to care?" We'd always find something that said both. Then there was Crystal, fresh out of college with student loans that had student loans, who couldn't afford much, but had an eye for style that could spot potential in a clearance rack from 3 blocks away. I started giving her first dibs on new arrivals in exchange for helping me with social media, and watching her confidence grow as she built a wardrobe piece by piece was better than any profit margin. And MS. Violet, 83 years old and still getting dressed every day like she had somewhere important to be, even if that somewhere was just the corner store for milk and lottery tickets. She'd come in monthly, always buying exactly one thing, never more, never less, and she'd tell me stories about the Harlem Renaissance like she'd been there dancing at the Cotton Club. "Baby girl," she'd say, running her fingers along a silk scarf or a beaded necklace, "you got to understand something about style. Style ain't about having money. Style is about knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Every piece of clothing is a choice, and every choice is a chance to tell the world something about your story." These women taught me that fashion wasn't frivolous. It was armor, it was art, it was a way of claiming space in a world that often tried to shrink you down. When Mrs. Patterson put on one of my blazers and stood a little straighter, when Crystal found a dress that made her feel like the CEO she was going to become, when Miss Violet selected a piece that honored both her history and her present, that was magic. That was purpose. But running a small business in a neighborhood where most people were choosing between rent and groceries meant that purpose didn't always pay the bills. I'd spend hours every week juggling payments, negotiating with suppliers, applying for small business loans that I knew I wouldn't qualify for but applied for anyway because hope costs nothing. Derek would find me some evenings, long after closing time, hunched over my laptop trying to make numbers add up to something sustainable. He'd sit next to me, not saying anything, just playing soft melodies on his guitar while I worked. Sometimes he'd start humming, and I'd find myself humming along, and for a moment the stress would lift just enough for me to remember why I was doing this. "You know what I think?" he said one night, after I'd spent 2 hours trying to figure out how to afford new inventory for the spring season. "I think you're building something bigger than you realize. This isn't just about clothes, Jazz. This is about showing people they matter, that they deserve beautiful things, that they deserve to feel beautiful." He was right, of course. But being right doesn't pay rent. Being right doesn't keep the lights on or put food in the refrigerator or cover the cost of health insurance that you can't afford but can't afford to go without. Still, every morning I'd unlock those doors with something close to faith. Faith that this day would be better than the last. Faith that the community I was serving would find a way to support the business that was trying to serve them. Faith that love and hard work and genuine intention would somehow be enough to make it all work. Some days that faith felt solid, unshakable. Other days it felt fragile as tissue paper, like one unexpected expense or one slow week could tear through it completely. But I held on to it anyway, because faith was the only thing standing between my dreams and the reality of giving up. I had no way of knowing that soon I'd lose more than just my business. I had no way of preparing for the lesson I was about to learn about how quickly life can take everything that matters to you, how violence can reach into the safest spaces and destroy them, how the very community you're trying to serve can become the place where your worst nightmares come true. But for now, in these last moments of innocence, I still believed that if you worked hard enough, if you loved deeply enough, if you held on to your dreams tightly enough, nothing could take them away from you. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I know the exact time because I've replayed that moment so many times that every detail is burned into my memory like a scar. The phone ringing in the darkness, my fumbling hand reaching for it, the way my heart was already racing before I even saw Grandma Maureen on the caller ID. You know that feeling when your phone rings in the middle of the night? That immediate knowing that something terrible has happened, that whatever voice is about to come through that phone is going to change everything. I knew before I answered. My body knew. My soul knew. Jasmine. Maureen's voice was broken, fractured, barely recognizable. Baby, you need to come to the hospital. You need to come right now. I was already reaching for clothes before she finished the sentence. What happened? Is it you? Are you okay? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, it's Derek, baby. Oh God, Jasmine, he's gone. Gone. Such a small word to carry such enormous weight. I heard it, but my brain couldn't process it. Gone where? Gone how? Gone as in he'd run away? Gone as in he was missing? Because gone couldn't mean what I thought it meant. Gone couldn't mean permanent. Gone couldn't mean never again. What do you mean gone? The words came out steady, logical, like I was asking for clarification about a store policy instead of the continuation of my brother's existence. They shot him, baby. Maureen was crying now, great gulping sobs that seemed to echo through the phone. They shot my baby. He's gone, Jasmine. He's really gone. The world tilted. I remember that sensation distinctly, like the earth had shifted on its axis and nothing was where it was supposed to be anymore. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and suddenly I was falling even though I hadn't moved. Shot. The word ricocheted around my skull like a bullet itself. Shot. Like in movies, like in news stories, like in other people's tragedies. Not in our story. Not to Derek. Not to my little brother who made music and believed in dreams and never hurt anyone in his entire 19 years of life. The drive to the hospital exists in my memory as fragments. Red lights that I may or may not have stopped for. Streets that looked familiar but felt foreign. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The radio playing some mindless pop song that seemed obscene in its cheerfulness. I kept telling myself it was a mistake. That there had been some mix-up, some confusion. That I'd get to the hospital and find out it was someone else, some other family's tragedy, some other grandmother making terrible phone calls in the middle of the night. Because things like this didn't happen to people like us. We were careful. We were good. We minded our own business and followed the rules and loved each other fiercely. That was supposed to be protection enough. The emergency room was fluorescent bright and antiseptic cold, full of people dealing with their own middle-of-the-night crises. I found Maureen in the waiting area, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, like grief had physically shrunk her down. She was still wearing her nightgown under a coat, her usually perfect hair covered with a scarf tied hastily, and when she saw me, she stood up and I watched her entire body crumble. We held each other in that sterile waiting room, two women clinging to each other while our world fell apart around us. She told me what she knew through tears and broken sentences. Derek had been walking home from a late-night recording session at his friend Marcus's apartment. It was just after midnight, maybe 12:15. He was 3 blocks from home when a car pulled up. They wanted his wallet, his phone, that guitar he loved so much, Maureen whispered against my shoulder. Marcus said Derek gave them everything. Didn't fight, didn't argue, just handed it all over. But they shot him anyway. They shot him anyway, baby. They shot him and drove away and left him lying in the street like he was nothing. Like he was nothing. That phrase lodged itself in my chest like shrapnel. Derek, who filled every room he entered with light and music and possibility, treated like nothing. Derek, who dreamed so big and loved so hard and saw beauty everywhere he looked, reduced to nothing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The police came eventually. 2 officers who looked tired and bored, like this was just another case number to be processed. They asked questions with the mechanical efficiency of people who had asked the same questions hundreds of times before. Did he have any enemies? Was he involved with drugs? Gangs? Did he owe anyone money? Each question felt like an accusation, like they were looking for reasons why Derek deserved what happened to him. I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand that he was a musician, that he was 19 years old, that he wrote love songs and called our grandmother every day and left little notes in my cash register with lyrics that made me cry in the best way. But I answered their questions with the same mechanical efficiency they asked them, because what else do you do? You participate in the ritual of investigation even when you know it won't bring back the person you've lost. You give them the information they need even when you know that nothing they do will ever make this right. They told us they'd found the car used in the shooting, stolen, of course, abandoned a few miles away. They told us there were witnesses, though most were too scared to come forward. They told us they had leads, that they were pursuing all avenues of investigation. They used phrases like ongoing case and doing everything possible and bringing the perpetrators to justice. All I heard was that the people who killed my brother were still out there, still breathing, still living their lives while Derek's had ended on a dark street corner for the contents of his pockets. Later, much later, we found out who did it. Dante Williams and his crew, a gang that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months, graduating from petty theft to armed robbery to murder. They'd killed my brother for $63, an iPhone with a cracked screen, and a guitar that he'd saved for 8 months to buy. $63. Less than what some people spend on lunch. Less than a tank of gas. Less than a decent pair of shoes. That's what my brother's life was worth to them. $63 and some electronic devices they could pawn for drug money. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days selling clothes that cost more than what Derek died for. That I'd stress about making rent when his killers thought his entire existence was worth less than one of the dresses hanging in my boutique. Value, I was learning, was a flexible concept that depended entirely on who was doing the measuring. But in those first hours, we didn't know about Dante or his crew. We only knew that Derek was gone, that violence had reached into our careful, loving world and stolen the person who mattered most. We only knew that the music had stopped, that the dreams had died, that the future we'd all been building toward had been erased in the time it takes to pull a trigger. They let us see him before they took him away. I wasn't prepared for how peaceful he looked, how young. Death had erased all the worry lines that came from dreaming big in a world that didn't always make room for big dreams. He looked like he was sleeping, like he might open his eyes at any moment and ask why we all looked so sad. But he didn't open his eyes. He didn't wake up. He didn't ask us anything ever again. That's when it really hit me, the permanence of it. The never again of it. No more late afternoons in my shop with his guitar. No more Sunday dinners with Maureen where he'd play new songs and we'd pretend to be his first audience at Madison Square Garden. No more random phone calls just because he'd heard something that made him think of me. No more brother. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I love you," knowing it was both the most important thing I could say and completely inadequate for everything I felt. Then I walked out of that room and left part of my soul behind. If you've never watched someone die from a broken heart, let me tell you, it's exactly as devastating as it sounds. Maureen started dying the moment we left the hospital. Not physically, not at first, but in all the ways that matter. The light went out of her eyes. The strength left her voice. The faith that had carried her through decades of hardship just evaporated. She aged 20 years in 20 days. Her silver hair went white. Her back, always straight with pride, curved inward like she was folding in on herself. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped doing all the little things that had made her apartment feel like home. She just sat in her chair by the window, staring out at nothing, waiting for something that was never going to come. I tried everything. I moved in with her, thinking she just needed company, needed someone to make sure she was eating and sleeping and taking care of herself. I brought her groceries and cooked her favorite meals, which she picked at politely before pushing away mostly untouched. I sat with her and talked about Derek, sharing memories, thinking that maybe if we kept his spirit alive in our conversations, it would give her something to hold on to. But grief, I learned, is not a problem you can solve with love and good intentions. Grief is a living thing, a parasite that feeds on joy and hope and the will to continue. And Maureen's grief was hungry. It devoured her appetite, her sleep, her interest in anything beyond the hole that Derek's death had torn in her world. "I raised that boy from a baby," she'd say, staring out her window at the street where children who weren't Derek played games and rode bicycles and lived full lives. "I held him when he cried, taught him how to tie his shoes, how to be good to people, how to dream big. I was supposed to protect him." "You did protect him," I'd tell her, kneeling beside her chair, trying to will some life back into her eyes. "You gave him 19 years of love. You gave him music and dreams and the knowledge that he mattered. You gave him everything." But she couldn't hear me. She was trapped in a prison of what-ifs and if-onlys. What if she'd made him take a cab instead of walking? What if she'd convinced him to stay home that night? What if she'd done something, anything, differently? I understood the feeling. I was torturing myself with the same questions. What if I'd closed the shop early and picked him up from Marcus's apartment? What if I'd insisted he move in with me? What if I'd been a better sister, a better protector, a better guardian angel? But while I was channeling my guilt into a desperate kind of energy, calling the police daily for updates, researching the gang that killed him, planning what I would do when they caught his killers, Maureen was disappearing into hers. She stopped going to church, which should have been my first real warning sign. Maureen had been going to Mount Olive Baptist every Sunday for 43 years. Through our parents' death, through financial struggles, through health scares and heartbreaks and every kind of trial life had thrown at her, she'd never missed a Sunday service. Her faith was the bedrock of everything else, the thing that gave her strength to keep going when keeping going seemed impossible. But after Derek died, she couldn't bear to sit in that sanctuary and hear about God's plan and mysterious ways and everything happening for a reason. She couldn't sing hymns about joy and redemption when joy felt like a foreign concept and redemption seemed like a cruel joke. "I can't pretend to understand this," she told me when I suggested we go to church together. "I can't sit in that pew and act like this makes sense, like there's some greater purpose to losing that boy. I can't do it, Jasmine. I just can't." Her doctor said it was depression, that grief could manifest as physical illness, that we needed to be patient while she processed the trauma. He prescribed medications that she wouldn't take, suggested therapists she wouldn't see, recommended support groups she wouldn't attend. He meant well, but he didn't understand that Maureen wasn't just grieving Derek, she was grieving everything. The future she'd imagined for him, the grandchildren she'd never have from him, the music that would never be written, the dreams that would never come true. She was grieving the person she'd been before his death, The woman who believed that love could protect the people you cared about, who thought that being good and faithful and hardworking would somehow shield your family from the worst kinds of pain. 3 weeks after the funeral, I found her collapsed in her kitchen. Heart attack, the paramedics said, though I knew better. Hearts can break literally as well as metaphorically. Hers had been cracking since the moment she got that phone call, and it had finally shattered completely. She lasted 6 days in the hospital. 6 days of machines and tubes and medical procedures that felt like elaborate ways of prolonging the inevitable. I sat beside her bed and held her hand and talked to her about everything and nothing, hoping that somewhere in whatever place her mind had retreated to, she could hear me telling her I loved her. On the last day, she opened her eyes and looked at me with more clarity than I'd seen since Derek died. "Take care of yourself, baby girl," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the beeping of monitors. "Don't let this poison you. Don't let what they did to him turn you into something you're not." Those were the last words she said to me. An hour later, surrounded by machines that couldn't keep her heart beating when it had lost its reason to beat, Maureen joined Derek wherever people go when they leave the world behind. And, just like that, I was alone. Not just temporarily alone, not just lonely, but fundamentally, completely, devastatingly alone. In the space of 6 weeks, I'd lost the 2 people who made up my entire family, my entire support system, my entire reason for believing that tomorrow might be better than today. You know what nobody tells you about grief? How expensive it is. Funeral costs, hospital bills, time away from work. Death is a luxury that poor people can't afford, but we don't get a choice about whether or not to participate. I'd spent nearly 3 weeks away from the boutique, first dealing with Derek's death and then trying to care for Maureen. 3 weeks of no sales, no income, no attention to the business that was already hanging by a thread. I'd closed the shop the day after Derek's funeral, putting up a small sign that said "Family Emergency, closed temporarily," thinking I'd be back in a few days once I made sure Maureen was okay. But Maureen was never okay, and those few days turned into weeks, and when I finally returned to Jasmine's threads, it felt like walking into a tomb. The clothes hung limp on their hangers, covered with a thin layer of dust. The mirrors reflected empty spaces. The gold paint on the walls looked faded, like the color had leached out of everything along with the joy. My regular customers had moved on, finding other places to shop, other ways to feel beautiful. The seasonal inventory I'd ordered before everything fell apart had been delivered and was sitting in boxes I couldn't afford to pay for. My landlord had left 17 messages, each one more urgent than the last. The electric company had sent a final notice. The credit card I'd used to cover Maureen's medical expenses was maxed out, and the minimum payments were more than I could manage. I did the math sitting at my little desk in the back of the shop, surrounded by the dreams that had once felt so achievable. Without family to help me, without savings to fall back on, without the energy or focus needed to rebuild my customer base, there was no way to make the numbers work. The boutique that had been my purpose, my identity, my connection to my mother's dreams, was over. The final blow came when I discovered that Maureen had taken out a second mortgage on her apartment to help me start the business. She'd never told me, never made me feel indebted, never asked for anything in return. But after she died, the bank made it clear that the loan was now my responsibility. Between what I owed on the boutique lease and what was owed on Maureen's mortgage, I was looking at debt that would take me years to repay, if I ever could repay it. So I liquidated everything. Had a closing forever sale where I sold beautiful clothes for pennies on the dollar to customers who seemed genuinely sad to see me go, but couldn't afford to pay what the pieces were actually worth. I watched my mother's dream, my grandmother's investment, my own heart and soul get marked down and carried away piece by piece. The hardest part wasn't losing the money or even losing the business. The hardest part was losing the identity. For 5 years, I'd been Jasmine who owns the boutique on Malcolm X Boulevard. I'd been the woman who helped other women feel beautiful, who created a space for elegance in a world that often made us feel invisible. Without the shop, I was just Jasmine whose brother was murdered and Jasmine whose grandmother died of grief. I was just another statistic, another casualty, another person that life had chewed up and spit out. The eviction from Maureen's apartment happened fast once the bank realized I couldn't take over the mortgage payments. 30 days to pack up a lifetime of memories, to decide what to keep when you don't have anywhere to keep anything. I kept photos and Derek's guitar and a few of Maureen's most precious belongings, storing them in a unit I could barely afford, knowing I probably wouldn't be able to afford it for long. Everything else, the furniture that held our Sunday dinner conversations, the kitchen where Maureen had taught me to cook, the living room where Derek had played his music. All of it went to strangers who saw bargains where I saw the dismantling of everything that had ever felt like home. My own apartment was next. Without income from the boutique, I'd been trying to survive on unemployment benefits and the little bit of money from selling my inventory, but it wasn't nearly enough. I held on for 3 months, getting further behind on rent each month, until my landlord, a man who'd known me for 4 years and had always been understanding about late payments, finally ran out of patience. "I'm sorry, Jasmine," he said, his discomfort obvious as he served me the eviction papers. "I know you've been through hell, and I wish I could help more. But I've got my own bills to pay, my own family to take care of. I can't carry you anymore." I understood. I even respected him for waiting as long as he had. But understanding didn't make it hurt less, didn't make the reality of homelessness any easier to accept. The night before I had to be out, I sat in my empty apartment, all my belongings packed into whatever I could carry, and I tried to figure out how I'd gotten here. 6 months ago, I'd had a family, a business, a home, a future. Now I had a duffel bag full of clothes, a storage unit I couldn't afford, and nowhere to go. I could have asked friends for help. Should have, probably. But grief had made me proud in all the wrong ways. I didn't want to be anyone's charity case, didn't want to sleep on couches and pretend I was going to bounce back when I knew I was broken in ways that might never heal. I didn't want to have conversations about how everything happens for a reason, or how I needed to stay strong, or how Derek and Maureen would want me to keep going. So I left. Packed what I could carry and walked away from the last address where I'd been somebody's granddaughter, somebody's sister, somebody who mattered. I became one of those people you see but don't really see, sleeping in my car when I could afford gas, in shelters when they had space, on park benches when everything else failed. The city looks different when you don't have anywhere to belong in it. Streets you've walked 1,000 times feel foreign when you're walking them with nowhere to go. People you've smiled at for years suddenly look through you like you're invisible. The whole rhythm of life changes when you're not part of it anymore, when you're just surviving it. I lasted 3 months living like that. 3 months of carrying my entire life in a bag, of washing up in gas station bathrooms, of eating whatever I could afford from dollar menus, of lying awake in my car listening to the city move around me while I wondered if this was how the story ended. If this was what became of dreams deferred and families destroyed and hearts too broken to keep fighting. It was during those months that I started seeing them around the neighborhood. Dante and his crew. Living large off other people's pain, driving cars that cost more than most people made in a year, wearing jewelry that could have fed families, acting like kings in a kingdom built on violence and fear. And that's when something shifted inside me. That's when the grief that had been crushing me down started transforming into something else. Something harder. Something that gave me purpose even when I'd lost everything that had given my life meaning. That's when I decided that if I was going to survive this, if I was going to find a way to keep living in a world without Derek and Maureen, I was going to make sure the people who destroyed everything I loved paid for what they'd done. Not through the legal system that had already failed me. Not through hoping that justice would somehow find its way to them. But through my own hands, my own plan, my own understanding of what they'd taken and what they owed. They'd made me into nothing. Now I was going to use that nothing to destroy them the way they'd destroyed me. The planning started small. watching their patterns, learning their habits, understanding how their operation worked. I had nothing but time and nothing but rage, and those are powerful motivators when you've got nothing left to lose. You want to know what rock bottom looks like? It's not what you think. It's not the dramatic breakdown you see in movies, all tears and screaming and obvious desperation. Rock bottom is quiet. It's sitting in your car at 2 a.m. in a Walmart parking lot, eating a 99-cent bag of chips for dinner because it's all you can afford, watching normal people live normal lives through the fluorescent-lit windows, and realizing that you've become invisible even to yourself. That was my life for 3 months. 3 months of existing in the spaces between other people's real lives. 3 months of learning that homelessness isn't just about not having a place to sleep, it's about not having a place to belong, not having an address that makes you real in the eyes of bureaucrats and employers and anyone else who might be able to help you climb back up. I'd become a ghost in my own neighborhood, drifting through streets where I used to matter, past the empty storefront that used to be my boutique, past Maureen's building where strangers now lived in the apartment that used to smell like Sunday dinners and unconditional love. But ghosts, I was learning, have advantages. They can move unseen. They can watch without being watched. They can observe the world from the outside and see things that people on the inside miss. And that's how I started noticing them. Dante Williams and his crew weren't trying to hide. Why would they? They owned these streets through fear and violence, and they wanted everyone to know it. They drove through the neighborhood like conquering heroes, music loud enough to announce their presence 3 blocks away, car doors slamming with the confidence of people who knew nobody would dare to complain. I saw them outside the corner store where Derek used to buy candy when we were kids, laughing about something while the elderly store owner watched them with undisguised fear. I saw them posted up outside the community center, dealing drugs to high school kids who should have been home doing homework instead of learning how to destroy their futures one hit at a time. But the moment that changed everything, the moment when my grief crystallized into something sharper and more focused, was a Thursday evening in December. I was sitting in my car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that barely ran but was the only shelter I had left, trying to make a can of ravioli last for 2 meals, when I saw him. Dante Williams himself. 24 years old, covered in gold chains that caught the streetlight like trophies, wearing a jacket that probably cost more than I used to make in a month at the boutique. He was standing outside Mrs. Rodriguez's hair salon, the one next to where my shop used to be, and he was laughing. Laughing. Not just smiling or chuckling, but throwing his head back, laughing like someone had just told the funniest joke in the world. Laughing like someone who didn't have a care in the world, like someone whose sleep wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the people he'd killed, like someone who didn't wake up every morning carrying the weight of other people's destroyed lives. He was laughing and my brother was dead. He was wearing jewelry that cost more than Derek's life was worth to him, driving a car that could have put 3 kids through college, living in luxury built on a foundation of other people's pain and terror. And he was laughing like none of it mattered, like the lives he'd taken and the families he'd destroyed were just footnotes in his success story. That's when I understood something fundamental about justice. The legal system I'd been waiting for, hoping for, praying would somehow make this right? It was designed by people who had never sat in a car eating cold ravioli while watching their loved one's killer flaunt the profits of his crimes. It was built for a world where fairness was possible, where consequences were guaranteed, where doing the right thing eventually led to the right outcomes. But I was living in a different world. I was living in a world where a 19-year-old musician could be murdered for pocket change, where his grandmother could die of grief while his killers got richer, where his sister could lose everything she'd ever worked for while the people who destroyed her family celebrated their success. In that world, justice wasn't something that got handed down from courtrooms and judges. Justice was something you had to take for yourself. I started that night. Not with violence. I wasn't ready for that yet. Didn't know if I'd ever be ready for that. But with observation. With learning. With understanding that if I was going to make them pay for what they'd done, I needed to know everything about how they operated, what they cared about, what they had to lose. Knowledge is power, Maureen used to say, and I was about to get a PhD in the anatomy of the gang that had destroyed my life. I followed them, learned their routines, their hangouts, their hierarchy. Dante was the leader, but he had lieutenants who handled different aspects of the operation. There was Marcus, not the Marcus who was Derek's friend, but a different Marcus, a thin man in his 30s who seemed to handle the drug distribution. There was Tommy, barely 18, who drove for them and seemed desperate to prove himself worthy of their respect. And there was Malik. Malik was different from the others. Older, maybe late 20s, with careful eyes and a way of carrying himself that suggested intelligence beyond the casual cruelty of street life. He didn't seem to enjoy the violence the way Dante did. When they talked about their crimes, and they talked about them openly, proudly, like war stories, Malik listened but didn't participate. He was strategic where they were impulsive, thoughtful where they were reactive. I watched him for weeks before I understood his role in their organization. He was the planner, the one who identified targets, who figured out timing and logistics, who made sure they didn't get caught. He was the brain behind their operation, the reason they'd been able to terrorize the neighborhood for months without facing consequences. He was also, I realized, my way in. Because here's what I'd learned about myself during those months of having nothing to lose. I was smarter than they were. I was more patient. I was more motivated. And most importantly, I was invisible to them. They'd never seen me as a threat because they'd never seen me at all. But I'd been watching them, learning them, understanding them in ways they didn't understand themselves. And I'd figured out something they didn't know. Their strength was also their weakness. Their confidence in their own invincibility was going to be exactly what allowed me to destroy them. The plans started forming slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle I was assembling in my mind. It would take time. It would take patience. It would require me to become someone I'd never been before, to do things I'd never imagined myself capable of doing. But I had nothing but time. And I had rage enough to fuel whatever transformation was necessary. They'd taken everything from me, my family, my home, my business, my future, my faith in the possibility of goodness in the world. They'd reduced me to nothing, made me invisible, turned me into a ghost haunting the wreckage of my own life. Now I was going to use that nothingness against them. I was going to become their nightmare, the consequence they never saw coming, the justice they thought they were too powerful to face. They'd taught me that innocence was a luxury I couldn't afford. Now I was going to teach them what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. The girl who believed in dreams and happy endings was gone, buried alongside Derek and Maureen in graves I could barely afford to maintain. What was left was something harder, something focused on a single purpose that would either redeem me or destroy me completely. Either way, Dante Williams and his crew were going to pay. Planning an infiltration isn't like planning a business or a vacation or any other normal life event. It's like planning your own death and resurrection, except you're not sure which version of yourself is going to emerge on the other side. I spent weeks studying them before I made my first move. Not just their criminal operation, but them as people. What they wanted, what they feared, what made them trust someone, what made them suspicious. I learned that Dante had a weakness for women who seemed helpless. It fed his ego to be the protector, the provider, the man who could save someone from their circumstances. I learned that Marcus was paranoid about undercover cops and informants, always watching for signs that someone wasn't who they claimed to be. And I learned that Malik valued intelligence over appearance, that he was drawn to people who could think strategically rather than just follow orders. The persona I created for myself was careful, calculated, designed to appeal to their specific psychology while hiding my true intentions. I became Jazz, close enough to my real name that I'd respond naturally, but different enough to feel like someone else entirely. Jazz who had grown up in foster care and aged out of the system with nothing. Jazz who'd been sleeping rough for months and was desperate enough to do whatever it took to survive. Jazz, who was smart enough to be useful, but vulnerable enough to not seem threatening. I practiced her in front of mirrors in gas station bathrooms, perfecting the slight change in posture that made me seem smaller, more fragile. I learned to make my voice softer, more hesitant, like someone who'd been beaten down by life and was afraid to take up too much space. I studied the mannerisms of desperation, the way truly desperate people move through the world with a combination of alertness and surrender, always scanning for opportunities while expecting disappointment. The hardest part was the wardrobe. Everything I'd owned from my previous life was either too expensive looking or stored in a unit I could no longer afford to access. I needed clothes that told the story of someone who'd fallen through the cracks, someone who'd been invisible for so long she'd almost forgotten how to be seen. I shoplifted. I'm not proud of it, but desperation makes you flexible about morality in ways you never expect. A few pieces from thrift stores that were having sales I couldn't afford, a jacket from a Goodwill donation bin, shoes that had clearly seen better days. I assembled a uniform of invisibility, clothes that would help me blend into the background of their world until I was ready to step forward. But the most important part of my transformation wasn't external. It was psychological. I had to become someone who could lie convincingly, who could manipulate people without flinching, who could earn trust while planning betrayal. I had to become someone who could look Dante Williams in the eye without killing him with my bare hands. I practiced on strangers first. Small lies, tiny manipulations, just to see if I could do it. I told a man at a bus stop that I needed change for a phone call to my sick mother, a lie, but it worked, and he gave me $2 with genuine sympathy. I convinced a woman at a diner to let me wash dishes for a meal, spinning a story about job hunting and temporary hardship that was technically true, but strategically incomplete. Each successful deception made the next one easier. Each time someone believed my manufactured vulnerability, I learned something new about how to weaponize their desire to help, their assumption that someone who looked as broken as I did couldn't possibly be dangerous. The first real test came when I approached one of their lower-level dealers, a kid named Jerome who couldn't have been more than 16. I'd been watching him for days, learning his routine, understanding that he was hungry for respect and recognition in a way that made him vulnerable to the right kind of attention. "Hey," I said, walking up to him with the careful hesitance of someone who is nervous but desperate. "I'm sorry to bother you, but someone told me you might be able to help me out." He looked me up and down, taking in my carefully crafted appearance of poverty and vulnerability. "Depends what you need." "I need work," I said, letting my voice shake just slightly. "I don't care what it is. I've been sleeping in my car for 3 months, and I'm about to lose even that. I'll do whatever you need. Clean up, run errands, whatever. I just need a chance." It was a risk. He could have ignored me, could have told me to get lost, could have been suspicious about why a stranger was approaching him. But I'd read him correctly. He liked feeling important, liked being the kind of person other people came to for help. "You a cop?" he asked, but without much conviction. I was too obviously desperate, too genuinely pathetic looking to be law enforcement. "Do I look like a cop?" I laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that had tears at the edges of it. "I can't even afford a decent pair of shoes." He studied me for another moment, then shrugged. "I might know somebody who's looking for runners. People to make deliveries, that kind of thing. You got a phone?" I showed him my cracked smartphone, the same one Derek had been carrying the night he died, the one the police had returned to me along with his other belongings. It felt fitting, somehow, to use his phone in my quest for justice. "All right," Jerome said, typing his number into my contacts. "Text me tomorrow. I'll see what I can set up." It was that easy. That terrifyingly, disappointingly easy. I'd spent weeks planning and preparing for this moment, and it turned out that desperation was a more convincing disguise than any elaborate scheme could have been. That night, sitting in my car in the Walmart parking lot that had become my unofficial address, I called Jerome and told him I was ready for whatever work he could find me. 3 days later, I was standing in front of Marcus, being evaluated for a position as a run girl, someone who transported drugs and money for the organization. Someone too insignificant to be worth police attention, but reliable enough to be trusted with valuable cargo. "You understand," Marcus said, his paranoid eyes scanning me for signs of deception. "This ain't a game. You mess up, you disappear. You try to steal from us, you disappear. You start running your mouth to the wrong people, you disappear. You following me?" I nodded, letting fear show in my eyes because fear was what he expected to see. "I understand. I just need the work. I won't cause any problems." "See that you don't," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "What happened to you anyway? How'd you end up like this?" I'd prepared for this question, crafted a story that was tragic enough to explain my circumstances, but not so dramatic as to be memorable. Lost my job, couldn't make rent. Family's all gone. Just trying to survive until I can get back on my feet. It wasn't entirely a lie. Every word of it was technically true, just missing the context that would have made me their enemy instead of their asset. "Ain't no shame in surviving," Marcus said, and for a moment I saw something almost human in his eyes. "Do good work, keep your head down, maybe we can help you get back on those feet." If he only knew that getting back on my feet was exactly what I planned to do, just not in the way he imagined. The first few weeks were about proving myself, establishing trust, becoming part of the background of their operation. I made runs without complaint, followed instructions exactly, never asked questions about what I was carrying or where I was taking it. I was reliable, invisible, forgettable, exactly what they needed and exactly what I needed to be. Slowly, carefully, I started gathering information. Not obviously, never taking notes, never asking direct questions, never showing more curiosity than a desperate person trying to keep a job would naturally have. But I memorized routes, noted patterns, identified key players and their relationships to each other. I learned that their operation was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. They weren't just random street criminals. They were part of a network that moved drugs and money through multiple neighborhoods, with connections to suppliers and distributors that reached well beyond our little corner of the city. They had corrupt cops on their payroll, judges who could be bought, lawyers who specialized in getting charges dismissed or reduced. But I also learned their weaknesses. Their overconfidence. Their assumption that anyone desperate enough to work for them was too broken to be dangerous. Their belief that fear was enough to guarantee loyalty, that poverty was enough to ensure silence. Most importantly, I learned about the safe. Malik mentioned it casually one afternoon when he was giving me instructions for a particularly large delivery. "This is serious money," he said, showing me the duffel bag I was supposed to transport. 20 grand easy. "You lose this, you better hope the cops find you before we do." "Where does it all go?" I asked, trying to sound curious rather than calculating. "I mean, after all the runs and deliveries, where does the money end up?" He looked at me suspiciously for a moment, and I worried I'd pushed too hard. But then he relaxed. "Safe place. Somewhere nobody can touch it." "That's smart," I said admiringly. "I wish I had somewhere safe to keep money. Back when I had money to keep safe." He laughed at that, and I saw him make a mental note. Jazz is harmless, Jazz is broken. Jazz wishes she had money, but doesn't expect to ever have enough to worry about protecting. Over the following weeks, he dropped more hints. The safe was in a location controlled by the organization. It required a combination that only a few people knew. It contained not just money, but also records, insurance policies, evidence that could destroy their enemies and protect their interests. It was their security, their insurance policy, their guarantee that even if everything else fell apart, they'd have the resources to disappear or fight back or start over somewhere else. It was also going to be my payday, because I wasn't just planning to expose them or get them arrested or see them face some kind of legal justice. I was planning to take everything they'd built on the foundation of other people's pain and use it to rebuild what they'd destroyed. I was going to take their money, their security, their power, and I was going to disappear into a new life funded by the profits of the violence that had killed my family. It was justice of a sort. Poetic justice, karmic justice, the kind of justice that doesn't depend on courts and judges and systems that had already failed me once. But first, I had to get close enough to learn the combination. I had to become trusted enough that they'd bring me into their inner circle, valued enough that they'd share their most important secrets. I had to make them believe that broken, desperate Jazz was exactly what she appeared to be, right up until the moment I revealed what she really was, their reckoning personified. 3 months into my infiltration, I'd become part of the furniture in their operation. Invisible, reliable, forgettable. Exactly what I'd aimed for. I made my runs, delivered their packages, collected their money, and slowly, carefully, gathered the intelligence that would eventually destroy them. But I hadn't counted on Malik. Not as an obstacle. I'd always known he was the smart one, the careful one, the one I'd have to be most cautious around. What I hadn't expected was for him to notice me in ways that had nothing to do with business, for him to see something in desperate, broken Jazz that made him want to protect her. It started small. An extra $20 in my payment envelope with a note that said, "For food." A warning that Marcus was in a bad mood and I should stay out of his way. A suggestion that I find somewhere safer to sleep than my car, along with the name of a shelter that actually had decent security. Why do you care? I asked him one afternoon when he'd insisted on driving me to a delivery instead of making me take the bus. We were sitting in his car outside an apartment complex in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, waiting for the buyer to show up. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I had a sister once. Younger than me. Smart, beautiful, had dreams bigger than this neighborhood could hold. He stared out the windshield, his hands tight on the steering wheel. She got mixed up with the wrong people, started selling. Found her dead in an alley when she was 22. Overdose. I felt something twist in my chest. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. The pain in his voice was familiar, the kind of pain that comes from losing someone you were supposed to protect. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Whatever else he was, however he'd chosen to make his living, he was a person who'd loved someone and lost them. I knew exactly how that felt. "Point is," he continued, "I see you trying to survive, and I remember her trying to survive, and I think maybe if someone had helped her, really helped her, things might have been different." The irony was suffocating. Here was someone offering me the kind of help I genuinely needed, the kind of compassion I'd been desperate for during those months of sleeping in my car and eating one meal a day. And I was lying to him about everything, who I was, why I was there, what I was planning to do to him, and everyone he worked with. "You don't have to take care of me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not your responsibility." "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe taking care of people when we don't have to is what makes us human instead of just animals." It was the kind of statement that should have come from Maureen, not from someone who worked for the people who'd killed my brother. It made him complicated in ways I didn't want him to be, human in ways that would make what I had to do harder. But it also made him vulnerable. And vulnerability, I was learning, was something I could use. Over the following weeks, Malik's protection became more obvious. When Marcus wanted to send me on a particularly dangerous run, Malik would volunteer to go instead or insist on providing backup. When other runners tried to intimidate me or steal from my earnings, a quiet word from him would make the problems disappear. When I looked tired or sick or more desperate than usual, extra money would appear in my payments. He was creating a debt, whether he meant to or not. Not a financial debt, but an emotional one. He was making himself important to me, necessary to my survival, valuable beyond his role in the organization. And slowly, carefully, I started to repay that debt with trust. Not real trust. I couldn't afford real trust, but the appearance of trust. The gradual opening up of someone who'd been hurt too many times to believe in kindness, but was starting to believe in him. I told him about the boutique, though I changed enough details to make the story safe. I'd owned a small business, I said, but it had failed when I couldn't keep up with the rent. I'd had family, but they were gone now. I'd tried to make it on my own, but the world was harder than I'd expected, less forgiving than I'd hoped. All of it was true, just carefully edited. And he listened like someone who understood that every person carrying a story had the right to tell it in their own way, at their own pace. What kind of business? He asked one evening when we were walking back from a delivery. It was late, the streets mostly empty, and something about the darkness made conversation feel safer, more intimate. Clothing, I said. Women's clothes. I wanted to help people feel beautiful, you know? Help them dress like the person they wanted to become instead of the person they thought they had to be. That's a good dream, he said. What happened to it? I let silence stretch between us, like I was deciding whether to trust him with the painful parts. Life happened. People I cared about died. Bills I couldn't pay. Turns out good intentions don't keep the lights on. Maybe not, he said. But maybe dreams don't really die. Maybe they just wait for better circumstances. It was such a hopeful thing to say, so completely at odds with the reality of who he was and what he did for a living. It made me wonder what dreams he'd had to abandon, what circumstances had led him to find better prospects in violence and crime than in whatever he'd originally wanted to become. What about you? I asked. What did you want to be when you grew up? He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Teacher, believe it or not. High school history. Thought I could make a difference, help kids understand that the past doesn't have to determine the future. What changed? Reality. Student loans I couldn't afford, classrooms I couldn't control, system that didn't want to change. Turns out wanting to help people doesn't pay the bills either. We walked in silence for a while, two people who'd had their dreams crushed by circumstances beyond their control. Except mine had been crushed by him and people like him, and his had been crushed by a world that didn't value the things he wanted to contribute. Do you ever think about going back? I asked. To teaching? Sometimes, he said. But this life, it's not easy to leave. The money's good, and more importantly, people respect you. Fear you, maybe, but that's a kind of respect too. Hard to give that up to go back to being nobody special. I understood that more than he knew. The power that came from being feared, the intoxication of having people take you seriously because they knew you could hurt them. I'd never experienced it before my transformation, but I was beginning to understand its appeal. Besides, he continued, I've done things. Things you can't undo, can't apologize for. Things that would make those kids I wanted to teach look at me like a monster. We all do things we're not proud of when we're trying to survive, I said carefully. That doesn't mean we can't be better. He stopped walking and looked at me with something that might have been hope. You really believe that? That people can change. I met his eyes and lied with absolute conviction. I have to believe that. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? What I didn't tell him was that I did believe people could change. I was living proof of that. The person I'd been 6 months ago, the woman who believed in justice and fairness and the basic goodness of people, was gone. In her place was someone harder, smarter, more ruthless. Someone who could lie to a man's face while planning his destruction. Someone who could accept his protection while preparing to betray him. Change was definitely possible. The question was whether it always led to something better, or whether sometimes it just led to something necessary. The shift happened gradually, so subtly that I almost missed it. Malik started including me in conversations that weren't directly related to business. He'd ask my opinion on things, which route would be safer for a particular delivery, whether a potential new runner seemed trustworthy, what I thought about the police presence in different parts of the neighborhood. It was clear that my answers mattered to him, that he valued my perspective in ways that went beyond the typical relationship between a lieutenant and a runner. I was becoming his confidant, his advisor, maybe even his friend. And that's when I realized I was in deeper than I'd planned to be. The problem with long-term deception is that it requires you to become someone else so completely that sometimes you forget where the performance ends and the person begins. Jazz, the desperate run girl, wasn't entirely an act anymore. She was a part of me, the part that had learned to survive by being useful, by making herself indispensable to people who could protect her. And Malik's protection was real. More than once, I watched him intervene on my behalf in ways that could have cost him respect or money or standing in the organization. When Tommy, the young driver who was always trying to prove himself, started pressuring me to do runs that weren't officially sanctioned, runs that would have put me in danger while putting extra money in his pocket, Malik shut it down with a conversation that left Tommy sullen and resentful, but no longer a problem. When Marcus started getting suspicious about my background, asking questions about where I'd come from, why I'd never been arrested, how I'd learned to navigate the drug trade so quickly, Malik provided cover stories that satisfied his paranoia while keeping me safe. I checked her out. He told Marcus when I was supposed to be out of earshot, but was actually listening from the next room. She's nobody special. Just another casualty of the system, trying not to starve. Nobody special. It should have stung, being described that way. Instead, it felt like victory. If Malik, who was smart enough to be dangerous, observant enough to be suspicious, believed I was nobody special, then my disguise was perfect. But the cost of that disguise was becoming clear. The more time I spent with him, the more I saw him as a person instead of just a target. He was funny in unexpected ways, philosophical about things that most people in his position never thought about. He read books, actual physical books that he carried in his car and quoted from during quiet moments. He had opinions about music and movies and politics that were more nuanced than I'd expected from someone in his line of work. More importantly, he was kind to me in ways that had nothing to do with sexual interest or power dynamics. He was kind like someone who'd been hurt and didn't want other people to experience the same pain. Kind like someone who still believed in the possibility of goodness even after years of living in darkness. And slowly, inevitably, I started to care about him. Not romantically, I was too focused on my mission for that, too aware of who he really was and what he'd done. But I started to care about him as a person, to worry about what my plan would do to him, to feel guilty about the trust he was placing in someone who was lying about everything. The guilt was dangerous. Guilt would make me hesitate at crucial moments, would make me second-guess decisions that needed to be made quickly and decisively. I couldn't afford to see him as anything other than a means to an end, a tool in my quest for justice. But late at night, alone in whatever shelter or abandoned building I was sleeping in, I'd find myself thinking about the sister he'd lost, about his abandoned dreams of teaching, about the way his face changed when he talked about wanting to help people. I'd wonder what his life might have looked like if he'd made different choices, if circumstances had been different, if the world had been more forgiving of people who wanted to do good but couldn't afford to. The breakthrough came 4 months into my infiltration, during what should have been a routine evening. Malik had picked me up for what I thought was going to be another delivery, but instead he drove to a diner on the outskirts of the neighborhood, the kind of place that stayed open all night and asked no questions about its customers. "I wanted to talk to you," he said after we'd ordered coffee and pie that I couldn't afford, but he insisted on buying. Away from everyone else, away from the business. My heart rate spiked. Had he figured out who I really was? Had I made some mistake, let some details slip that revealed my true identity and intentions? About what? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "About you," he said. "About what you want from this life, what your plans are, where you see yourself going." It wasn't suspicion in his voice, it was concern. The kind of concern you have for someone you care about, someone whose future matters to you. "I don't have plans," I said, which was both true and completely false. "I'm just trying to get through each day." "That's not enough," he said gently. "Not for someone like you. You're smart, you're careful, you see things other people miss. You could do more than just survive." The irony cut deep. He was right. I was doing more than surviving. I was planning, preparing, building a case that would destroy everything he'd worked for. But I couldn't tell him that. "What are you saying?" I asked instead. "I'm saying maybe it's time you thought about your future. Real plans, not just day-to-day survival." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "I could help you. Get you out of the running game. set you up with something safer. Maybe even help you start over somewhere new. The offer was genuine, and that made it worse. Here was a man who dealt in violence and drugs, offering me exactly what I'd told myself I was working toward, a chance to escape, to rebuild, to become someone new. And he was offering it out of kindness, out of care for someone he thought he knew. Why would you do that? I whispered. Because everyone deserves a chance to become who they're supposed to be, he said. And because I care about what happens to you. I stared into my coffee cup, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of his trust, his affection, his completely misplaced faith in someone who was planning his downfall, it was almost unbearable. I need to think about it, I said finally. Of course, he said. Just don't take too long, okay? This life has a way of making decisions for people if they wait too long to make them for themselves. As he drove me back to the shelter that night, I realized I'd reached a crossroads. I had enough evidence to start building a case against the organization. Photos, recordings, financial information, details about their operations and their hierarchy. But to get enough for a conviction that would stick, I needed more time, more access, more trust. And that meant deeper deception. It meant accepting Malik's protection while planning his destruction. It meant letting him care about me while I prepared to betray that care in the most devastating way possible. The woman I'd been 6 months ago would have found another way. She would have tried to save him somehow, to warn him, to convince him to turn against his associates and save himself. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who understood that sometimes good people made bad choices, and those choices had consequences that couldn't be undone by good intentions or belated regret. Malik had chosen his path when he'd chosen to work for the people who killed my brother. The fact that he was capable of kindness, that he had dreams and regrets and genuine care for others, didn't change that fundamental truth. So I made my choice too. I would take his help, accept his protection, and use his trust to get close enough to destroy everything he'd built. And if that made me a monster, then at least I'd be a monster with a purpose. 6 months. That's how long it took to gather everything I needed. 6 months of careful documentation, of building relationships, of becoming indispensable to an organization I was planning to destroy from within. By the time I was ready to make my move, I wasn't just another runner anymore. Malik had been true to his word. He'd elevated me within the organization, given me responsibilities that brought me into direct contact with their financial operations, their supplier networks, their distribution strategies. I found my opportunity the next morning when Malik mentioned that they were concerned about security for the meeting. Too many new faces in the organization, too many people who hadn't been properly vetted, too much risk of infiltration or betrayal. What if you brought someone you trust completely? I suggested during our morning coffee. It had become our routine, meeting at a different diner every few days, talking through problems and plans under the cover of casual conversation. Someone whose only loyalty is to you personally? Like who? He asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew where this was going. Like me, I said simply. I don't know enough about the business to be a security risk, but I know enough about people to spot trouble. And more importantly, I owe you everything. My safety, my life, my chance at a future. If someone was planning to betray you, I'd know. The irony of that statement was so complete it made me nauseous. But Malik smiled like I'd just offered him the perfect solution to his problem. "You'd do that?" he asked. "It's dangerous. If something goes wrong, if there's trouble, you could get hurt." "I'm not afraid," I lied. "Not if I'm with you." He reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm and gentle. "You know I care about you, right? More than I should, maybe, but I do." "I know," I said, and squeezed his hand like someone who cared about him too. Like someone who wasn't planning to use that care to destroy him. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll talk to Dante. But you follow my lead, you don't speak unless someone asks you a direct question, and if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately." "Understood." "Understood," I said. That night, alone in my current shelter, I called Rivera and gave her the details. Location, time, security arrangements, estimated number of participants. Everything she needed to plan a raid that would catch them all in the act. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Once we move, there's no going back. Your cover will be blown, your safety compromised. These people don't forgive betrayal." "I'm sure," I said. "This is what I came here to do." "What about Malik?" she asked. "The one who's been protecting you. You ready to watch him go down with the rest of them?" I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his kindness, his dreams of teaching, his genuine care for someone he thought was just a lost girl trying to survive. "He made his choice," I said finally. "Now I'm making mine." The warehouse was exactly what you'd expect from a drug deal worth $2 million. Isolated, defensible, with multiple exit routes and clear sight lines in all directions. Malik had chosen the location personally, and his security arrangements were thorough but not excessive. Enough firepower to handle trouble, but not so much as to attract unwanted attention. I arrived with him 2 hours before the meeting, helping to check the perimeter and set up the basic security measures. To anyone watching, I looked like what I was supposed to be, a young woman who was there because someone important trusted her, someone whose job was to stay alert and keep her mouth shut. But I was also wearing a wire that Rivera's team had designed to look like a pendant necklace, and I had a GPS tracker sewn into the lining of my jacket. They knew exactly where I was, and they could hear everything that was happening. The participants arrived exactly on schedule. Dante, of course, looking like a man who'd never doubted his own invincibility. Marcus and 2 other enforcers, carrying enough weapons to start a small war. The supplier, a man I'd never seen before but whose reputation was legendary in certain circles, with his own security team and 2 large duffel bags that I assumed contained either drugs or money. And Malik, who stayed close to me throughout the preliminary negotiations, occasionally touching my arm or shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and affectionate. The meeting proceeded exactly as Rivera and I had anticipated. Formal introductions, verification of the merchandise, discussion of payment terms and delivery schedules. The kind of careful, professional negotiation that people conduct when millions of dollars and decades of prison time are at stake. I provided the real-time updates Rivera needed by speaking in a code we'd developed, casual observations about the weather, comments about how tired I was, questions about when we might leave. To anyone listening, it sounded like nervous small talk from someone who was out of her depth. To Rivera's team, it was detailed intelligence about timing, participants, and the progress of the transaction. Everything was going according to plan until Dante's phone rang. He answered it with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never learned that phones could be monitored, that conversations could be recorded, that even the most careful criminal operations could be infiltrated. But what I heard in his voice as the conversation continued was something I hadn't expected: confusion, then concern, then outright alarm. "What do you mean, federal surveillance?" he said, his voice carrying clearly across the warehouse. "Since when? How long have they been watching?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Everyone stopped what they were doing and focused on Dante's conversation with deadly intensity. "I don't care what your source says," Dante continued. "We're in the middle of something here. If there was federal heat, we'd know about it." But even as he said it, I could see him starting to doubt. His eyes were scanning the room, looking for threats, for explanations, for someone to blame. And then his gaze landed on me. I'd been so focused on providing updates to Rivera that I hadn't noticed Malik watching me. Hadn't realized that my casual comments and questions might sound different to someone who knew me well, someone who'd learned to read my expressions and my body language. "Jazz," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. "Who are you talking to?" "What do you mean?" I asked, but I could hear the false innocence in my own voice. "You've been talking to yourself for the past 20 minutes, he said. Making comments about things nobody asked about, asking questions that don't make sense in context. Who are you talking to?" The room went completely silent. 6 men, all of them armed, all of them with everything to lose, staring at me with the kind of attention that usually preceded violence. Dante ended his phone call and walked over to where Malik and I were standing. His expression was calm, but I could see the fury building behind his eyes. "Strip her down," he said to Marcus. "Check for wires, trackers, anything electronic." "Dante," Malik said, stepping between us. "She's with me. I vouch for her." "Your vouching doesn't mean shit if she's federal," Dante replied. Marcus moved toward me, and I realized I was out of time. In about 30 seconds, they were going to find the wire, the tracker, and probably evidence of the phone I'd been using to communicate with Rivera's team. In 60 seconds, I was going to be dead, and Rivera's case was going to fall apart. Unless I could buy time. "Wait," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the warehouse. "Before you do anything irreversible, you should know who I really am." Dante held up a hand, stopping Marcus in his tracks. "I'm listening." I looked at Malik, seeing the confusion and growing horror in his eyes as he started to understand what was happening. "My name isn't Jazz Coleman. It's Jasmine Davis. And my brother was David Davis." The name meant nothing to most of the people in the room, but I saw Dante's expression change, saw memory and recognition replacing confusion. "David Davis," he repeated slowly. "The college boy who thought he could steal from us and walk away." "The college boy you had murdered," I corrected. "For stealing enough money to pay for his girlfriend's medical treatment." Malik was staring at me like I'd just confessed to being an alien. "You're his sister." "I'm someone who's been planning your destruction for the past year," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was beating so hard I was surprised it wasn't audible. "And in about 2 minutes, this place is going to be surrounded by federal agents." The silence that followed that statement was the kind of silence that precedes explosions. Everyone in the room processing the implications, calculating their options, preparing for violence. And then Marcus pulled his gun. "You stupid bitch," he said, raising the weapon toward my head. "You have any idea what you've done?" But before he could pull the trigger, before anyone else could react, the warehouse doors exploded inward and Rivera's team poured through the openings like water through a broken dam. Federal agents. Everybody on the ground. Now, what followed was chaos. Shouting, gunfire, people running in directions that led nowhere, the kind of pandemonium that happens when careful plans collide with desperate reality. I hit the floor and covered my head, trusting Rivera's people to know where I was and to avoid shooting me by mistake. Around me, I could hear the sounds of a battle that lasted maybe 90 seconds, but felt like an hour. When the shooting stopped and the dust settled, Dante was in handcuffs, Marcus was on the ground with a bullet in his shoulder, and the supplier was zip-tied next to his duffel bags of money and heroin. And Malik was sitting against the wall, staring at me with an expression of such complete betrayal that I had to look away. The aftermath of the raid was controlled chaos. Federal agents processing evidence, paramedics treating the wounded, crime scene technicians documenting everything for the trials that would follow. I sat in the back of an ambulance, being checked for injuries I didn't have while Rivera briefed me on what would happen next. "Dante's looking at life without parole," she said. "The drug and conspiracy charges alone would be enough, but with the weapons violations and the money laundering, he's never seeing daylight again. Marcus too, probably, depending on whether he cooperates." "What about the others?" I asked, though I already knew what the answer would be. "Most of them will cut deals. Reduce sentences in exchange for testimony, cooperation with other investigations. The small fish always do." She paused, following my gaze to where Malik was sitting in the back of another ambulance, his wrists zip-tied, his face blank. "He's not small fish, though. Lieutenant in a major trafficking operation, directly involved in distribution and enforcement. He's looking at 20 to 30 years minimum. 20 to 30 years. Most of his life gone. His dreams of teaching, his hope for redemption, his plans for helping other people avoid the mistakes he'd made, all of it ending in a federal prison cell. Did he hurt anyone?" I asked. I mean, directly. Did he kill anyone? Rivera checked her notes. Not that we can prove. His role was mostly organizational, financial. He was the brains behind the operation, not the muscle. She looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. That doesn't make him innocent, Davis. He knew what he was part of. He chose to be part of it. I know, I said. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different things. You did good work, Rivera continued. This operation had been running for years, destroying communities, getting kids addicted, financing violence all across the region. Because of what you did, that stops now. I nodded, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was watching Malik, seeing the way he held himself like someone who'd been broken from the inside out. He hadn't looked at me since my confession in the warehouse, hadn't acknowledged my existence in any way. But as Rivera's team prepared to transport him to federal holding, he finally turned his head in my direction. Our eyes met across the parking lot, and I saw something in his expression that was worse than anger, worse than hatred. I saw understanding. Complete, devastating comprehension of exactly what I'd done and why I'd done it. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look was enough to convey everything. The recognition that I'd planned this from the beginning, that every moment of kindness I'd shown him had been calculated, that every trust he'd placed in me had been a weapon I'd used against him. And underneath all of that, the terrible knowledge that if their positions had been reversed, he probably would have done the same thing. They put him in the van and drove away, and that was the last I saw of Malik Rodriguez. But not the last I thought about him. 3 days later, after the initial debriefings and paperwork, Rivera approached me with an offer that surprised me. We want you to testify, she said. Federal grand jury, probably multiple trials, depending on how many of them decide to fight the charges. Your testimony would be crucial for securing convictions. What does that mean for me? I asked. Witness protection, relocation, new identity. If you want it, she said. But honestly, most of these people are going to prison for a very long time. The immediate danger to you would be minimal. I thought about it for approximately 10 seconds. No, I said. No? I did what I came here to do. Dante's going to prison. The organization is destroyed. Justice is served. I don't need to spend the next 5 years of my life reliving this in courtrooms. Rivera looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her it would be pointless. What are you going to do instead? That was a good question. For the past year, my entire existence had been focused on this single goal. Now that it was accomplished, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. But I had an idea. That evening, I made my way back to the neighborhood where I'd spent the past 6 months. Most of the gang's safe houses and operational locations were being watched by federal agents, but there was one place I knew they hadn't found yet, a storage unit that Malik had mentioned in passing. A place where he kept emergency funds and documentation for situations exactly like this one. He'd told me about it during one of our conversations, back when he still trusted me completely. He'd even given me the location and the access code as a safety measure in case something ever happened to him and I needed resources to disappear quickly. Unit 247 at the Secure Store facility on Maple Street, he'd said. Code is 8294. There's enough money in there to get you somewhere safe and give you a fresh start. At the time, I'd filed the information away without really planning to use it. But circumstances had changed, and I was no longer the person who worried about the ethics of taking money from criminals. The storage facility was exactly where he'd said it would be, and the code worked exactly as he'd promised. Unit 247 contained a fireproof safe, 2 duffel bags, and several boxes of what looked like personal items and documents. The safe required a combination that he'd also given me. The birthday of the sister he'd lost, the sister whose death had made him want to protect people like the person he thought I was. Inside was more money than I'd seen in my entire life. Stacks of hundreds, carefully organized and rubber banded, along with multiple fake IDs, credit cards, and what looked like deeds to several properties in different states. I took the money, all of it. Left the documents and the fake identities, took only the cash that would let me start over somewhere else, become someone new. It wasn't stealing, I told myself. It was compensation for services rendered, payment for the year of my life I'd spent becoming someone I didn't recognize in service of a justice that felt increasingly hollow. But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't entirely true. I was taking Malik's emergency fund, his insurance policy, his last chance at starting over if everything went wrong. Except everything had gone wrong, and it was my fault, and he was going to prison for 20 to 30 years, and his emergency fund wasn't going to help him anymore. So I took it, and I didn't feel guilty about taking it, and that told me more about the person I'd become than any amount of self-reflection could have. I left the city that night, driving a car I'd bought with cash from a dealer who asked no questions and kept no records. I had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between myself and everything that had happened. I drove for 2 days, stopping only for gas and coffee, until I reached a small college town in Montana that seemed far enough away from everything to qualify as a new beginning. I rented an apartment under the name Sarah Mitchell, using one of several fake IDs I'd acquired during my months of preparation, and for the first time in over a year, I had no agenda beyond figuring out who I was going to be next. The money from Malik's safe was enough to support me for several years if I was careful, longer if I invested it wisely. I could go back to school, start a business, travel, volunteer for causes I believed in, all the things that normal people did when they weren't consumed by grief and the need for revenge. But I found that normal wasn't as easy to return to as I'd expected. The woman who'd owned a boutique and believed in justice and fairness was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that good and evil weren't as clear-cut as she'd once thought. Someone who'd discovered that she was capable of deception and manipulation and betrayal when the circumstances required it. I'd gotten my revenge. Dante was in federal prison, probably for the rest of his life. The organization that had killed my brother was destroyed. Justice, by any reasonable definition, had been served. But I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied or at peace. I felt empty, like I'd accomplished exactly what I'd set out to accomplish and discovered that accomplishment wasn't the same thing as resolution. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd find myself thinking about Malik. About his kindness, his protection, his genuine care for someone he'd thought was just trying to survive. About the dreams he'd had to abandon, the future he'd planned that would never happen now because of choices I'd made. I told myself that he'd made his own choices, that working for people like Dante came with consequences, that my brother's death deserved justice regardless of the cost to people who'd participated in the system that killed him. All of that was true. But truth and comfort weren't the same thing either. 6 months after leaving the city, I was walking through downtown Missoula when I saw a help wanted sign in the window of a small nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless veterans. They needed someone with administrative experience, someone who understood what it was like to lose everything and have to start over. I stood outside that window for 20 minutes, thinking about second chances and redemption and the possibility that the person I'd become didn't have to be the person I remained. The next morning, I applied for the job under the name Sarah Mitchell. I used skills I'd learned during my year of deception to create a convincing background, to become someone with the right qualifications and the right motivations for the work they needed done. But unlike my previous performance, this one wasn't entirely false. I did understand what it was like to lose everything. I did know what it took to survive when the world seemed determined to destroy you. And I did want to help people who were trying to rebuild their lives from nothing. Maybe that was enough. Maybe becoming someone who helped people was a kind of redemption, even if the help was built on a foundation of lies and stolen money and betrayals that couldn't be undone. Maybe the person I'd been, the woman who believed in simple justice and clear morality, was gone forever. But maybe the person I was becoming could find a different kind of purpose, a different way of making the world better than it had been. I got the job. I was good at it. And slowly, carefully, I began the long process of figuring out who Sarah Mitchell was going to be, what her life was going to look like, what kind of future she could build from the ashes of Jasmine Davis's need for revenge. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I first decided to infiltrate Dante's organization. It wasn't justice in the clean, satisfying way I'd hoped it would be. But it was an ending that let me sleep at night, most nights, and in the world I'd learned to live in, that was probably the best anyone could ask for. Sometimes, late at night when the guilt was particularly strong, I'd think about writing Malik a letter. Explaining why I'd done what I'd done, apologizing for the deception, maybe even offering to help his family in some way if he had family who needed help. But I never wrote that letter. Some betrayals were too complete for apologies, some choices too final for second chances. I'd made my decision when I'd chosen revenge over mercy, justice over compassion. Now I had to live with the consequences of that decision, the same way Malik had to live with the consequences of his. The difference was that I was free to build something new from those consequences, while he was locked in a cell, paying for choices that weren't entirely his own, but were his responsibility nonetheless. That difference would always be part of who I was now, part of the price I'd paid for the justice I'd sought. I could accept it, I could build a life around it, I could even find a kind of peace with it. But I would never forget it. And maybe that was justice too, not just for my brother, but for everyone whose lives had been changed by the choices we'd all made in service of our own ideas about right and wrong. Maybe forgetting would have been the real crime.